The cold came in off the dark between stars, and on the docking ramp it was always worse. It pressed through scale the way it never pressed through walls, through corridors, through the sealed warmth of throne rooms. Out here there was no architecture to argue with it. Just the ramp, the dark, the slow groan of the ship's hull adjusting against the pressure of open space, and her, standing at the edge, left hand in a glove. Empress Kovati had been standing at the edge of docking ramps for 8 years. Not every ramp, not always this one, but she had learned, over the course of 8 years and 43 diplomatic stations and more star crossings than she had bothered to count, that the edges of ramps were reliable in a way that throne rooms never were. No one came to the edges. The cold kept them away. And if the cold didn't, she did. The blue-black of her scales catching light at the wrong angles, the obsidian crest that ran from her crown to the back of her neck, and the scars. Always the scars. Silver-white against the dark blue of her left side, running from her jaw to her collarbone to her forearm in a pattern that had never faded and never would. Battle damage from a war that had ended 11 years ago. The scales there cracked along the fault lines of the injuries and healed crooked, ridged, wrong. They caught the cold differently than the rest of her. They always ached at temperature extremes. She wore a glove on her left hand. Everyone knew why. No one said so. The crest along her spine had not moved in months. Korvati crest responded to social warmth, the involuntary biological response to being in the company of someone who wished you well. In court, in council, in every room she occupied, the crest stayed flat. She had learned not to notice its stillness the way you learn not to notice the absence of a sound you used to love. An advisor had come this morning. Datapad extended at arm's length, eyes on the screen, never once lifting to her face. She had watched the deliberate angle of his chin. She had filed it away with the others. 8 years of filed records. 8 years of flinches, of quickened footsteps, of conversations aimed at the wall just past her left ear. She had tried, once, to understand the pattern. It was the scholar in her, the part that had catalogued every battle variable before the war, every diplomatic inflection before negotiation. She had applied the same rigor to the flinching. Distance maintained, duration of eye contact, angle of avoidance relative to the scar's position. She had a complete data set. It told her nothing useful. People flinched. That was the sum of it. The ramp creaked beneath her boots. She shifted her weight. The glove was tight. It was always tight, and her fingers had gone still inside it the way they always did in the cold. The stars did not flinch. She stood at the edge, and the dark held her gaze steadily, and that was enough. If you're new here, this is Stellar HFY Stories, and we tell these quietly. Subscribe so you don't miss one. The welder arrived at the far end of the ramp at 0640. She heard him before she saw him. The clank of a kit bag set down on metal, the soft metallic rattle of tools checked and arranged, the scrape of a visor being adjusted on a forehead. Low sounds. Workman sounds. He didn't announce himself. He didn't appear to register that he was not alone on the ramp, or if he did, he gave no outward evidence of caring particularly. She turned, slightly, by reflex. He was human, medium height, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had done physical work long enough for the body to simply settle into the shape the work required. Dark hair pushed back, a little rough around the edges, the kind of face that suggested he had slept adequately but not well. His name, she would later learn from the assignment roster, was Kale. 31 years old. He had been contracted to the ship's maintenance division for 6 weeks. His assignment today was a stress fracture in the ramp railing, third section from the outer edge, identified in the overnight structural scan. He crouched beside the railing with his kit and began to work. He did not look at her. Not the deliberate not looking she was accustomed to, the careful avoidance with its own particular weight. He simply had a job to do and was doing it, and she happened to be standing 20 meters away, and neither of those facts seemed to require comment. His hands moved with the focused economy of someone who had performed this task so many times the individual movements had stopped requiring thought. She noticed the scars on his knuckles. Old ones, from the particular texture of them. Work scars. The hands of someone who had put them against hot and sharp things many times and kept going. She noticed that he was not wearing gloves. She looked away before the observation could settle into something she would have to categorize. He worked. She stood at the edge. The ramp groaned softly in the cold. From somewhere down the corridor, a guard said something quiet to another guard. The other guard didn't answer. A welder had no business being 20 meters from an Empress on an empty ramp. But the railing needed welding, and here he was. He finished the first section of the fracture in 40 minutes. She knew this because she had been watching the work with the part of her mind that defaulted to observation when the rest of it had nowhere useful to go. Not watching him, watching the work. The torch, the seam, the careful passes. He had a steadiness to his technique that she found, against all logic, easier to look at than most things on this ship. He stood, stretched his back, a short, unself-conscious movement, the kind that meant he'd been at this long enough for it to cost him something. He gathered the first section of his kit, moved it 3 meters down the railing toward the second fracture point. Toward her. She did not move. The second fracture was 4 meters away. He crouched again, set his kit, checked the seam. His back was to her now, not as a gesture, just as an orientation. The work was in front of him. She was behind him. He didn't adjust. The glove on her left hand was very tight. His torch hummed to life. He worked in silence. No sound except the steady breath of the flame and the occasional soft tick of metal cooling. The cold pressed in from the dark beyond the ramp's edge. 4 meters. Her crest lay flat. Her scales were still. Her fingers had not moved inside the glove in several minutes. And then, without turning, without pausing in his work, without any preamble, he shifted to finish the seam, pushed upright to gather his kit for the third and final fracture point, and walked beside her. Not behind, not a wide arc to the far edge of the ramp. Beside her, close enough that the air shifted, close enough that she registered the warmth coming off him, the contrast of it against the cold from the dark, the particular human quality of heat that was different from the environmental warmth of sealed rooms. He walked at the pace of someone carrying a kit to the next work site, which was what he was doing. He did not look at her scars. He did not look away from her scars. He walked beside her as though she were anyone standing on a ramp on a cold morning, which was, to every external appearance, exactly how he understood the situation. His tools shifted in the bag. His boots were steady on the metal. He reached the third fracture point and crouched. A pause, then the tools settling. Her gloved hand at her side. His kit bag on the railing near it, close enough that she could feel the faint residual warmth rising off the torch compartment. The glove was right there. The bag was right there. The distance between them was measured in centimeters, not decorum, and no one had made it that small with her in 8 years. Her fingers did not move. The glove held its shape. She looked at the stars. She didn't hear the first plate shift. She felt it. Corvati scales locked under threat. They had been locked for a long time. Not from threat exactly, but from the sustained low-grade tension of existing in rooms where people flinched, where eyes went sideways, where the distance kept and the decorum maintained was its own particular kind of wall. The scales responded to walls the way they responded to any environmental pressure. They locked. They held. It was what they did. The plate that shifted was on her left forearm, near the glove's edge. 1 plate, 1 degree of movement, unlocking with a sound so quiet she might have imagined it, except that she had a complete scientific understanding of what Corvati scales sounded like when they moved, and she had not heard that sound from her own body in a very long time. She went still in a different way than she had been still before. The welder worked. His torch moved in its careful passes. His breathing was steady. A tool shifted. He didn't look up. Her crest, flat for months, flat for so long she had stopped registering its stillness as an absence, trembled. 1 millimeter. A single involuntary movement, upward, then back. Gone almost before it happened. She pressed her right hand flat against her thigh. The gesture accomplished nothing except giving her something to press against. Her scales on her left forearm had unlocked. 1 plate. She could feel the cold on that small exposed surface differently now. The air reaching the softer tissue beneath, the fine-grained sensitivity that the locked position had been armoring. It was not comfortable. It was something stranger than comfortable. It was the way a thing felt when it stopped bracing. She did not look at the welder. He finished the third seam. The torch went out. For a moment, the ramp held only the sounds of a tool being packed and a ship breathing in the dark. At the far end of the corridor, one guard said quietly to the other. Her crest moved. The other guard said nothing for a long moment. Then, very low, her scales unlocked. The left arm. I could hear them from here. A pause. That hasn't happened since before the Verith campaign. My briefing notes said it wasn't thought to be possible anymore. The damage was supposed to be permanent. The first guard did not answer. The welder shouldered his kit. She had 8 years of data on flinching. She had none on this. Her mind, which had catalogued 43 diplomatic stations and the precise angle at which every advisor held his datapad to avoid her face, had no category for a human who walked beside her on a cold ramp and treated the distance between them as a practical question rather than a political one. Who put his tools 4 centimeters from her gloved hand and went back to work as though her presence was simply a feature of the space, the way the cold was a feature of the space, the way the dark beyond the ramp's edge was a feature of the space. Unremarkable, unremarked upon. She had tried, in the past 8 years, to understand the flinching. She had built a data set. She did not have a methodology for the opposite of flinching. The guards at the far end of the corridor were not moving. She was aware of their stillness the way she was aware of most things. Peripherally, precisely, filed away. They were watching. They had heard the scales. They did not know what to do with the information any more than she did. The welder was nearly at the corridor threshold, kit over one shoulder, visor still pushed up on his forehead. He was not thinking about her. She was almost entirely certain of this. He had done his job. He was going to his next job. The fractures in the railing were sealed. That was the sum of his morning. Her crest had moved. Her scales had unlocked. She stood at the edge of the ramp with her gloved hand at her side and the cold pressing in from the dark. And the part of her mind that had spent 8 years trying to understand the flinching turned its full, precise attention to this instead. It did not have an answer. It had only the question, and the question was this: he had not flinched. He had not looked away, had not maintained distance, had not adjusted his pace or his bearing or the natural swing of his arm to account for her presence. He had simply been near her, as though nearness were a neutral condition. She had forgotten what that felt like. Her fingers moved inside the glove. Slowly, for the first time in 8 years. Come back for part 2. She hasn't moved. He doesn't know what he left behind on that ramp. She stayed on the ramp. This was not a decision. Exactly. She had nowhere else to be for another 40 minutes. And the ramp was where she was, and moving felt like it would require acknowledging that something had happened. And she was not ready to classify what had happened. Not yet. The scholar in her required data before classification. She had one data point. She needed more before she could name it. So she stayed. The guards at the far end of the corridor had not moved either. She was aware of them with the same peripheral precision she brought to everything. And she chose not to look at them directly, because looking at them directly would require acknowledging that they had heard the scales, and she was not ready for that particular classification either. The cold pressed in. Her left forearm was still unlocked. That single plate. She kept waiting for it to re-engage, for the tension to return, for her body to remember its posture and correct back to it. It didn't. The plate stayed open. The cold reached the softer tissue beneath it, and she registered the sensation with the detached precision of someone taking a reading. She had a data set on flinching. She had a methodology. 8 years of careful observation. She had nothing for this. Her crest lay flat again. The single millimeter of movement had been and gone so quickly she might have convinced herself it was involuntary static, a glitch in the biological system, meaningless. She was, in fact, attempting to convince herself of exactly this. The attempt was not going well. She looked at the place on the railing where his kit bag had rested. The metal there was no warmer than the rest of the ramp. Of course it wasn't. He had been gone for several minutes, and residual heat did not persist on cold metal, and she was not standing here cataloging the thermal signature of a welder's kit bag like a first-year research cadet. She looked at the stars instead. The stars did not flinch. They also did not walk beside her. She pressed her right hand flat against her thigh, filed the data point, said nothing. Still, The corridor beyond the ramp was quiet for the better part of an hour. Then boots on metal, a familiar cadence, though she did not yet know why she recognized it. The sound resolved into the welder coming back through the corridor threshold, kit bag over one shoulder, a secondary tool case she hadn't seen before in his other hand. He stopped at the railing, ran a hand along the sealed seams, checking his own work. Crouched, pressed a thumb against the joint. Stood. She had not moved from the edge. He turned and saw her and said, with a complete absence of ceremony that appeared to be his natural register, "Cold out here." It was not a question. She looked at him. Yes. He nodded, the way a person nods when information confirms what they already knew, and set the secondary case down near the railing. He opened it, pulled out a calibration tool she recognized as unnecessary for any of the seams he had already finished. He was running a secondary check. He had come back to verify his own work. Her crest did not move. Her scales did not shift. But something in the architecture of her attention rearranged itself without asking her permission. The precise, habitual orientation of a focus that had spent 8 years pointed outward, toward exits, toward the careful angles of avoidance, turned instead toward the 10 meters between her and this human who had come back to check his seams in the cold. He worked. She watched him work. At the far end of the corridor, neither guard spoke. He found something on the third seam. She could tell by the way his calibration tool paused. A small hesitation, barely a second, but she had a scholar's eye for the granular. He ran the tool back over the same section. Checked the reading. His expression didn't change, but his posture shifted fractionally, the recalibration of someone deciding whether something is worth the additional effort. He decided it was. He set down the calibration tool, opened the kit bag, pulled out the torch. 15 minutes of work. Unhurried, precise, the same quality of focus she had watched from 20 meters all morning. The flame moved in its careful passes. Her breath came out slow in the cold. The stars beyond the ramp's edge held their positions. When he finished, he went through the same sequence in reverse, torch packed, calibration tool run again over the seam, reading checked, reading accepted. He closed the secondary case. He stood. He looked at the railing for a moment, the way a person looks at work they are satisfied with. Then he looked at her, not at the wall past her left eye, not at the safe neutral point of her right shoulder, at her face, and then, without apparent decision, at the left side of her face, the scars, the cracked scales, the silver-white lines that ran from her jaw to her collarbone. He looked at them the way he had looked at the railing seam. Like information, like something that simply was what it was, and was worth looking at directly. Her left hand moved. Not much. The glove shifted, her fingers pressing briefly against the interior, against the glove's palm, as if testing whether the barrier was still there. It was still there. He picked up his kit. His eyes dropped to the glove. The question had no warning, no preamble. It arrived in the space between one breath and the next, spoken the way he spoke everything, quietly, without ceremony, as though it was simply the next logical thing to say. Don't cover it. Not for me. 6 words. He was already reaching for the secondary case. He said it like it was about the ventilation, about the cold, about any of the practical and unremarkable features of the ramp. He said it like it cost him nothing, because to him it cost nothing. It was simply true, and he was a person who appeared to say things that were simply true without first calculating whether he was allowed to. He shouldered his kit. She had stopped breathing. Not dramatically, not in the way of stage performances and diplomatic theater. She had simply stopped, somewhere in the middle of the 6 words, and had not yet found the mechanism to start again. She would replay this later, with the full precision of a scholar's memory. She would turn the 6 words over like an artifact of unknown origin, examining the weight distribution, the material composition. She would be unable to categorize them. They would resist every framework she applied. Right now, she stood on the cold ramp with her breath held and her left hand inside its glove and her crest. Flat for months, flat for 8 years of aggregate months. Lifting. Not 1 millimeter this time. Her crest rose in a slow, full movement. The biological response she could not override. The one that meant trust had begun at a structural level. The one that her species had no voluntary control over. the one that she had not felt move in a direction that was not flat or flatter in 8 years of careful, catalogued, utterly exhausting stillness. He didn't look back. Not because he didn't care. She understood this now. In the way she understood things she didn't yet have language for. He didn't look back because he had said what was true and he didn't require a response to a thing that was true and he had work to get to. His boots were steady on the ramp. His kit shifted over his shoulder. He passed the threshold into the corridor and his footsteps went quiet on the carpet beyond. At the far end, one of the guards made a small sound. Not a word, just the sound a person makes when they have been holding their breath for some time. Her crest was still up. She became aware of this as a fact, as a data point she would need to account for, to integrate into her data set, to understand before she could proceed with any of the rest of her day. She had a meeting with the Diplomatic Council in 38 minutes. Her crest was up. The scales on her left forearm were unlocked. She had stopped breathing approximately 6 words ago and had since resumed, but not at the correct depth. She had a complete methodology for flinching. She had nothing for this. The official incident report, filed 3 days later by the ship's intelligence division under pressure from the Diplomatic Council, who had heard from the guards, who had heard the scales, would describe the morning as follows. A maintenance worker had performed unauthorized extended work in a restricted area, had engaged an Imperial subject in unsanctioned proximity, and had made a remark of unclear intent that had produced a measurable biological response in said Imperial subject, the significance of which was, quote, still being assessed. The report was 9 pages long. It used the phrase first contact event twice. It misspelled the welder's name. He had gone to fix a pipe fitting in sublevel 4. He would later report that it had been a straightforward job. He came back the next morning. Not for her. The ramp's 4th railing section had been flagged in the overnight scan. Hairline fracture. Non-agent, but the kind of thing that compounded if you left it. He had the assignment. He came back. She was already there. She told herself she was there because the edge of the ramp was where she stood in the mornings. Because the cold was honest. Because the stars held steady. She had a list of reasons, all accurate, and she did not examine the order in which they occurred to her. He set his kit down at the 4th section. He looked at the railing. He crouched. She looked at her left hand. The glove was on the railing. She had taken it off. She didn't remember deciding to. She had been standing at the edge, looking at the stars, and at some point her right hand had reached over and pulled the glove from her left hand and set it on the railing. And the scarred scales were bare in the cold air, the cracked lines, the silver-white damage, all of it visible and open, and she did not put the glove back on. Her crest was up. His torch hummed to life. He worked. She stood at the edge of the ramp with her bare left hand at her side, and the cold pressed in off the dark between stars and reached all the way to the soft tissue beneath the unlocked scales, and somewhere at the far end of the corridor the guards were very quiet. The glove stayed on the railing. Tomorrow he'll be back. The fracture on the 5th section was flagged an hour ago. If you want to see what happens when she stops cataloging and starts just being there, come back. We'll be